the trajectory of California, it was by far the most polarized state in the country when it adopted top two in 2012. And its trajectory was to be, continuing to become more and more polarized quite quickly.
California has had top two open primaries since 2012, and you analyzed the impact of this reform from a lot of different vantage points: competition, voter satisfaction, voter turnout, voter participation, voter impact, and party strength.
I think there's also an individual level within party difference in polarization that we should be thinking about more. And I think the top two allows for real differences within a party in terms of the way people approach issues.
When that race is between two Democrats, and you have this high turnout election with a bunch of independents and a bunch of Republicans, they're going to be casting the decisive vote between those two Democrats. And lo and behold, what we see is that it's typically the more moderate of those candidates, the more representative of the district of those candidates who win.
It's great. Thank you, everyone, for taking time on a Thursday afternoon. Very excited to have a chance to speak with Dr. Richard Barton about his new report on the impact of open primaries in California. Very privileged today to have a great co-host, my longtime friend, Dr. Christian Grose, who is a professor of political science and public policy at the University of Southern California. Christian he's the author of more than 50 articles, chapters, and papers exploring issues of public policy and reform and the relationship between the two. And he is, in my estimation, one of the most thoughtful and innovative researchers out there looking at political reform issues. So thank you, Christian, for joining me as a co-host. I think you're on mute. Can you just, I'll come back. Anyway, there you are.
No,
okay.
There we go. I'm back. So I was having some unmuting issues, but yeah, thanks. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Thank you for making the time. Our guest today is Dr. Richard Barton. Richard is an associate professor in the Maxwell School at Syracuse University. He received his PhD in government from Cornell. And his research is really interesting. It examines how electoral and legislative institutions shape lawmaking, both in Congress and in the broader American political economy. In addition to being at Syracuse, he is a fellow at the Unite America Institute, and he's the author of California's Top Two Primary: The Effects on Electoral Politics and Governance, which is a fantastic new report that just came out in June, and the reason we're gathered today to have a discussion. So welcome, Dr. Barton. Great to have you with us today.
So happy to be here. Thanks for having me, John and Christian.
Yeah. So let me just set the stage for our participants, and then I'm going to turn it over to Christian. So California has had top two open primaries since 2012. And you analyzed the impact of this reform from a lot of different vantage points. One of the things I loved about this report is it looks at it from different angles: competition, voter satisfaction, voter turnout, voter participation, voter impact, which is something I want to ask you a bunch of questions about. You call them elections of consequence, and party strength. And what you found, broadly speaking, was that the open system, the nonpartisan system, has had a significant positive impact on California. This is a great paper. I have a lot of questions. Let's get right into it, and then we're going to open it up in about 20 minutes for your questions. So Christian, take it away.
Yeah, thanks. So I have a few questions, and I've read the report, and I want to concur with everything that John said. I think it's really great. I think it's the thing that was really needed to sort of summarize a lot of what we know and what we don't know, and you added a lot to that, which is great. I think one thing that would be helpful is to just sort of set the stage a lot of people who are looking for electoral reform to solve problems are concerned about increasing polarization in the country, in their states, in the legislature, both at the federal level and the state level. A big part of your report talks about polarization. Can you just sort of summarize what are what you call the depolarizing effects of the top two primary?
Yeah. Okay. I think that's a good place to start. So, so I, so the sort of big finding is that if you look at the impact of top two on California, in isolation, just look at what happened before and after. What you see is that it had a very small depolarizing effect on the California state legislature. So, the state California Assembly and California Senate. However, when you look at it within the broader context of what happened over that decade, that finding in California is actually, I would say, significantly more impressive than if you just look at the raw numbers in California. So nearly every other state in the country polarized from 2012 up until 2020 when the data stops in the analysis here. And only two other states in the country depolarized more than California. So, and if you focus on the Western region, like neighboring states, Oregon, Arizona, Utah, Colorado, Texas, this was a region that was polarizing faster than any other in the country, right? So, so California depolarized a little bit during this period. And if you just look at that, you might say, like, I don't know, kind of a modest impact. But the argument I would make is when you control for the fact that this was a highly polarizing time, right? I mean, this is a time of, the second half of the second Obama term and then the Trump administration. When you control for both what's happening over time and in the Western region in particular, that these results, the fact that California depolarized at all during this period is actually quite impressive.
Yeah, no, that's something I wanted you to talk about. I think as a follow-up, my take, people come to me and they say, oh, California has changed their primary, but California is one of the most liberal places in the country. How could it be that it's less polarized? And I think that might be, as you just pointed out, the wrong question, right? It's not. This state in the last decade has gotten much different politically than it was, in the 1990s and in the 2000s, right? It's changed. The demographics have changed, the population have changed. So can you work through what that means? Like, what would California have looked like in terms of polarization in the legislature without the reform, right? So you're talking about how the state is becoming more polarized, and then it's reduced relative to comparison states. But what do you think would have happened had the same system been in place, or maybe a close primary system had been in place?
Yeah, I think that's a great way to think about it, right? And so, so political, like Christian and I, political scientists would call this like the counterfactual, right? And this imagined alternative history where California never implemented top two, what would we have expected to find, right? And yeah, in addition to everything I just said about controlling for time and controlling for the region, I mean, if you just look at the trajectory of California, it was by far the most polarized state in the country when it adopted top two in 2012. And its trajectory was to be, continuing to become more and more polarized quite quickly. And so, I mean, it's still by I'm using scores created by Boris Shore and Nolan McCarty, other political scientists, and this is the most common way to measure polarization at the state level. And by their scores, California is still the second most polarized state, only behind Colorado. But it used to be the most polarized state by a huge margin. In fact, if you were to take the 50 states and rank them from 1 to 50, the most in level of how polarized they are, the biggest gap between any two states would have been the gap between Colorado at number 1 and the number 2 state. And so the fact that it's not number one anymore is actually quite a meaningful pivot for the state.
Oh, go ahead, John.
No, I just because I'm not a political scientist, and sometimes I grapple with terms like polarization, which on the one hand they sound very self-evident, but tell me, what do you mean by it? And also, is political science, is the definition of polarization kind of evolving or changing, or is there debate about what it even means? Is that an active discussion? But tell me first, what do you mean by polarization?
Yeah, so it's a great question. And Christian, I'm interested to hear your thoughts on this too, because
Do you want me to go, or you want to go?
um, I guess I'll just give you the answer, the technical answer of like what I mean in this report, and
Okay,
then I'll let Christian chime in on like the
great.
bigger picture, because I have all sorts of concerns and issues about how we conceptualize, how we measure polarization in government. I will be perfectly honest with you that like there are things I don't love about the measurement, but it's what everybody in the field uses, and so that's what I rely on. And what we mean by it really is, we talk about polarization in terms of like ideology, right? How ideologically extreme are the members of each party, and how divergent are they? So how far apart on an ideological spectrum is the average Democrat from the average Republican? But there's a battle in the discipline over whether or not we're really measuring ideology, or are we just measuring partisanship, right? And maybe they're not. Maybe these measures aren't really capturing how ideologically extreme they are. They're capturing how partisan and like all the teamsmanship that's happening within government. And I would say we're doing both, right? And we have no way of like disentangling those two things, the level of partisanship versus ideology. So when I say polarization, it's a measure that's really capturing both those things.
Yeah, I mean, I think of polarization in two ways, and then I think relating to your question, John, there's a third way we should be thinking about it, but
Uh-huh.
aren't. And I think we think of polarization, like Rich said, Democrats and Republicans, they're in a legislature. How far apart are they from each other? Are they so far apart they never speak to each other? They only have caucuses where they come up with ideas, or are they actually close enough that they might do something policy wise, solve problems? Right. The closer they are, that's depolarizing. That's less polarized. The further away, that's polarized. The other way to think about polarization is at the voter level, which we haven't talked about yet, but we will. Our voters polarized too, right? And voters, there is some evidence that people who are activists in parties are polarizing quite a bit over the last couple of decades. But then the evidence of rank and file voters, that differs, and that's actually not the same. And so the gap can also be legislatures that are polarizing, or elected officials that are polarizing, Republicans and Democrats farther apart than ever, while voters may have a distribution that looks different. The other thing I think we should be looking at, I think the top two gives us an opportunity to do that, as do a lot of other alternative electoral systems, is ideological diversity in a legislature within the same party, right? So you've got a bunch of Democrats in California. Some of them, are kind of hard left Democrats that are very polarized from Republicans and from even members of their own caucus. Others are, yeah, pretty liberal, as you might expect in a state like California, but they work with the Chamber of Commerce, and they think about business, and they think about labor. And they, I think there's also an individual level within party difference in polarization that we should be thinking about more. And I think the top two allows for real differences within a party in terms of the way people approach issues.
I just realized I'm making an assumption that everybody knows what top two is in California. Maybe the two of you could just 20 seconds just describe the system that we're talking about.
I was thinking the same thing. I was looking at some of the comments and thinking,
Yeah.
yeah. So so you've been using the term open primaries. The way
Right.
I think of it is, so you can have open partisan primaries in which Republicans and Democrats hold their own separate elections, really primary elections, but they can open it up to independents or even members affiliated with the other party, right? The top two is, I would call it a nonpartisan, an open nonpartisan primary, by which I mean all of the candidates compete directly against each other. There's not there's not a separate election for each political party, right? So in the first stage, all Democrats, all Republicans, all independents, all third party candidates are running directly against each other. And the two candidates that receive the most votes, they move on to the general election.
Got it. Okay, good. A question about that, and then I'm going to turn it back over to you, Christian. One of the things that I found interesting in your report is that you said that 25, okay, so one of the features of the top two is that sometimes the top two candidates are two Democrats or two Republicans. It's just whoever are the top most popular candidates. And you make this statement that in those same party races, two Democrats, two Republicans against each other, that 25% of the time, the person who came in second wins the general election. And I thought that was interesting, but why do you think that's important? What's significant about
that? Is that directed towards me or to Christian?
Yeah, I'm sorry. Yes, to you.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, first I'll say empirically, this is significant because this is where we see the most moderating impact from a top two system. And so what I mean by that is it's when we have these same party elections that decidedly more moderate candidates seem to outperform, especially. And the reason why that is, I think, is as frustrating as it is. Like if you were a Republican in a deep blue district, and you go, in November, you show up in November, and your ballot has two Democrats, that probably feels really frustrating, right, and a bit alienating. But counterintuitively, or maybe not counterintuitive, but like ironically, it's also when you're sort of at your peak political power, because when that race is between two Democrats, and you have this high turnout election with a bunch of independents and a bunch of Republicans, they're going to be casting the decisive vote between those two Democrats. And lo and behold, what we see is that it's typically the more moderate of those candidates, the more representative of the district of those candidates who win. And so there's a bit of a tension here where, a lot of times people who affiliate with the other party that gets boxed out feel that frustration, but end up having the most power in those same party general elections. Because remember, if this is typically happening in a deep blue district, the alternative is that you go and cast a vote for, if you're a Republican, for a Republican who has no chance of winning in that election, right? And you're left with the Democrat who the only election that really mattered for them was the partisan primary that, where a more liberal voting base was deciding who that candidate was.
Got it. Thank you. That's interesting. Christian?
Yeah, I wanted to pivot just a little bit, but it's related to this about voters, right? So thinking about how a top two primary system impacts voters and what you talk about in your report, both on electoral competition and then just voter turnout in general. Voter turnout is generally not as high in primaries, right? So the kinds of people who show up in primaries, especially in close primaries, but even in earlier elections, tend to be more ideologically extreme. And then people in the general election are different. Like, how does that play out in California in terms of your report's findings on turnout and competition?
So the question on turnout is a bit tough to tease out. I mean, it seems to be that the top two system gives a bit of a boost as far as primary turnout is considered, which makes some sense because you have more candidates, the competition is more dynamic, but overall it's a bit hard to say exactly what that boost is, because these are also, California and Washington are also generally higher turnout states anyway. And it's hard to say like exactly what impact top two is having on that. But the evidence suggests that there is some boost to turnout. I think more importantly, though, than just looking at turnout, is that voters just have a lot more influence. They have a lot more impact in these elections than they would in a typical system. And that it changes but it changes the electoral calculation and the strategy of these candidates. And what I mean by that is, if you're an independent voter, for example, even in an open partisan primary state, you have to pick between voting in the Democratic or the Republican primary. And what ends up happening is the sort of power of independent voters tends to get diluted because they're being like sorted into two separate elections, right? Being split into two separate elections where they're competing with like a highly partisan base. Because the top two system is one single election where all the candidates are competing directly against each other, and all of the voters are casting votes in that same election, it doesn't divide up independent voters the same way and even an open partisan primary system does. And so this is why, in my opinion, they have a much bigger impact, because this is now a large, not divided up voting block that the candidates have to compete over in order to win these races.
I never thought about that. The way in which open partisan primaries, while better than closed, how they dilute the power or potential power of independent voters because they force people into a partisan arena. Yeah. And in a partisan arena, independents who are not partisans, almost it's like they walk in with their hands tied behind their back. But in the nonpartisan system, independents can, in some ways, act as independents. That's really interesting. I never thought of that. One other question, Dr. Barton. One of the things you talk about in the report is something called, you describe it as political learning. That one of the things that you're an advantage point to do is now look at this change 10 years out. So it's been 10 years. And describe a process by which voters and candidates and politicians start adapting to or utilizing the new dynamics in the system. Whereas you can't find that 2 days after the reform is enacted, because if you've been in office for 48 years, you're not going to change how you campaign, no matter what the rules are. Talk to us about like, what have you discovered in terms of political learning? I know that's a big question, but give us some of your top line thoughts on that.
Yeah, it's a really good question. So I should also say the reason why I started really thinking about the impact of political learning and the idea that like these reforms might take some time to develop, it actually started. I have to give most of this credit to Christian, actually, in his research. So there was an earlier line of research that found that top two really didn't have any sort of moderating impact on polarization. And then Christian produced a study that came out, I think it was 2020, correct me if I'm wrong, it was something around there, that found that actually there was a quite sizable impact. And the only difference was that those original studies, while they got a lot of attention and influenced the political science discipline early on, those early studies only had like one or at best 2 election cycles worth of data that they were analyzing, whereas Christian was coming at it, about 8 years after that, right? So we had a full decade worth of data to examine. And so I started thinking of the reasons of, well, like, why might you see such a big difference, a decade in, but not in those first few cycles? And, there's a whole line of research on this idea of political learning. But the way I think of it is, John, you illustrated this when you talked about, someone who's an incumbent isn't automatically just going to change their platform and their campaign strategy just because there's an election reform. It takes trial and error for it's not immediately obvious to everybody what the new strategy should be, right? Like what those new calculations should look like, what the incentives are. It takes time for those to develop from the perspective for candidates to learn through trial and error. for them to be, you know, less successful, and then diagnose the problem and realize that, you know, they have to start catering towards more moderate, more independent voters in order to win these kinds of races. That is something that takes losing, or at least, you know, underperforming. It takes trial and error. But then you also have like advocacy coalitions are changing around this, right? Donor networks are changing around this, because they are also adapting to these reforms. And what I mean by that is, you know, a lot of times donors are giving to candidates that are going to win, that they think are going to win, because they're trying to like curry favor, right? It's not always them just giving to the candidates they want, especially some of like the PACs, you know, like you think of like organized labor or your trade associations, things like that. And so, you know, when they start realizing that different kinds of candidates are winning, it starts changing their donation strategy. So long story short, like all of these different dynamics, right, they're all interacting with each other, and they all sort of take some time, for all of these different kinds of actors to learn the new incentives.
Yeah, can I add on that too a little bit, John?
Yeah, dive in.
Yeah, so I mean, I agree with everything Rich said, and I think the learning process is also part of new people getting elected. So in that study I did that Rich mentioned, it was really important to see the top two's effect over a decade instead of just immediately after. And one of the things that happened is people retired, people were term limited, new people got elected. The new people that get elected come in under the top two system. They're thinking strategically, how can I win in this system? And their behavior is different than the people that were elected in the old system who sort of stuck around in the
Right.
top two, or kind of the hangers on in 2014, right? And so a lot of the effect is also just the new people getting elected in new systems, like the top two in California, are the ones that are most likely to change their behavior compared to the old people who were elected under the old system.
I found it really interesting because in some ways we've been talking about this anecdotally for years. But it's helpful to have like you, Dr. Barton, like talk about this from a political science vantage point and get some terminology so it moves beyond anecdotes. But just this week, myself and an open primaries supporter, we had lunch with a congressman from California who beat a 30-year incumbent 2 years after open primaries was enacted. And what he said to us was, hey, this guy was used to getting elected as a Democrat. All he had to do was talk to the Democratic Party, you know, bigwigs, the union heads, the heads of the interest groups. He completely ignored any independent or Republican that lived in his district for 30 years because they didn't matter. And he based his campaign on going out and talking to them, and he won. But that's just an anecdote. Like it's hard to kind of really start projecting that on a broader level. So I really appreciate you drilling down to what that is, you know, what that, and I like the name political learning. We're going to open it up for questions in about 2 minutes. Christian, do you have one more question? And then we'll open it up.
Yeah, I had one more question. So thinking about, Pennsylvania just had a number of former elected officials announce a move endorsing open primaries, not necessarily top two. I saw a colleague who's a professor at Penn State say, "Oh, I wish we had top two, not open." What would happen in a place like Pennsylvania if a top two primary were adopted?
No, I don't.
So, I mean, so first of all, it would be a huge change for Pennsylvania, right? Which is right now a closed primary state, right? So, California at least had a bit more of an open partisan primary system before top two. So, I mean, the short answer is I would expect, if Pennsylvania were to adopt top two nonpartisan primaries, I mean, I would expect it to be even more transformational than it was in California. The other thing I would say is, and this, maybe I'm stretching a little bit beyond your question, but I'm going to take the liberty here, this opportunity, which is, and I wrote an op-ed about this. I forget where it went. It was in the Fulcrum and then got published in other outlets. but where I make the argument that really the more we pass these kinds of reforms, the more we should expect to see change in behavior, because there are all these sort of like spillover effects from partisan primary systems and closed partisan primary systems that impact legislators from more open and from top two systems, right? So like Kevin McCarthy, right, is elected under a top two system, but you can see how he's constrained, right, and how his decision making is shaped by a bunch of other lawmakers, by a bunch of other Republicans who are elected in closed partisan primary systems. And so, we see this in a lot of policy areas, but I think that the more we see these reforms spread across the country, the more we should, we're going to get to a tipping point where those constraints imposed by colleagues that are elected under a much more closed system will start going away as the number of colleagues elected under a closed system reduces.
Thank you. All right, we're going to open it up. We're not going to get to every question. There's so many great questions in the chat here. I want to start with my good friend Danny Ortega, but before we bring Danny in, I just want to queue up. There was a very interesting interchange in the chat between Eric Hamill and Harry Kresge on the question of outcomes and moderation. So I'm going to call on the two of you in a minute here to come in and bring that conversation in here. But first, I want to go to Danny Ortega in Arizona, who has a question about polarization in Arizona. Go ahead, Danny. Oh, you got to unmute yourself, Danny. Sorry.
I would think that most would believe that Arizona is polarized, but for this last election, I would have agreed. But if you look at the makeup of those elected to statewide office in Arizona, mostly Democrat, where, as in the past, it was mostly Republican. If you look at the state legislature, both in the Senate and the House, they're literally one vote away, the Democrats, from being in a majority. Are we talking about a polarization based upon representation, or are we talking about polarization based on ideology? Because I think all of you would agree, and I think this has kind of been answered, but Arizona is, I think, an example. We could all agree that Arizona is polarized politically. But if you look at the House, you look at the Senate, and you look at statewide office and what occurred in this last election, from an outsider who doesn't know very much about Arizona, they wouldn't think it was polarized. And I think it's a good conclusion that because of this last election, that though ideology may be polarizing, elections are different. And here we're in closed primaries. So how do you make the argument? I think 10 years ago, I could have made the argument that Arizona would suffer defeats beyond belief in general election, the Democrats, which turned out not to be true. And our system is still the same from 12 years ago. So that's why I asked the question.
Thanks, Danny. Appreciate that. That's a tough question.
Yeah.
We're coming out with some fastballs here. These are not softballs. Go ahead. Any thoughts, Rich or Christian?
So the question is, so when you say Arizona, when you look in state government, it doesn't appear polarized. You're pointing towards like it's still very competitive between the two parties. Is that what you're saying?
Actually, it's becoming more competitive. It never used to be. It was a given fact that Republicans would win. Okay, now in the era of Trump, okay, we were talking about a different dynamic here. It looks like it's going in a different direction, and that moderates or the independents in general elections are having more impact than they had in the past. So the argument for top two in Arizona, if you look at the landscape now, is not as great as it was 10 years ago, given the political environment that we're in. So from an outsider's point of view, you would still believe ideologically that Arizona is polarized, but from looking at the election results, you would have to question that.
I mean, do you mind if I jump in?
Yeah.
I have some thoughts, but go for it, Christian.
Oh, no. So, I mean, sure. I don't agree entirely. So the state is very competitive in 2022 and in 2020. I mean, it was surprise Democratic vote win at the presidential level in 2020. And and so on. But if you look at, and there's also competitive House districts. I think that's partly due to the redistricting commission as much as anything else, not the primary system. But some pretty extreme people have gotten through the primaries in Arizona, even in 2022 and 2020. And I don't want to pick on anybody, but I might just pick one.
There's plenty.
There's many.
There's plenty. Go ahead.
Right. So like if you think about some of the more in this case, I think some of the more very Republican leaning House districts and state legislative districts in Arizona, like Paul Gosar, you right, like these are 40% point Republican districts. He's gonna win a close primary and he's gonna win the general, right? But I would see a top two primary in Arizona, you'd have Paul Gosar and some other conservative Republican who maybe is a little bit better on sort of working with the party, working with, the occasional Democrat, but also still very conservative because the district is conservative. Like a top two primary would probably make it harder for someone like Gosar to win. Or, you could even see some of this with some very Democratic districts in the Phoenix area where you would have two Democrats running against each other. So I do think at the state legislative level and the congressional level in those very, very heavy R or very D districts, the top two would make a difference. And then I think in Arizona is just, those are some pretty close general elections, right? You're a couple thousand votes away from, people who I would say are pretty extreme winning and who have won in Arizona previously. I mean, somebody shot a congresswoman in Arizona. And, it's like there's some extremity going on in Arizona that the primary system itself will not solve, but I do think it could make a difference in some legislative districts.
Thank you.
I think that's well put. I was gonna say something similar, and I would just say, I mean, I don't know what you guys think of your current governor in Arizona, but I mean, I think Kari Lake certainly I would have considered her a pretty polarizing governor. And I mean, she was only a few thousand votes away from winning. And I don't think she comes anywhere near as close in a top two system.
Got it. All right. I want to go to Harry and Eric, who had this interchange in the chat about moderation and desired outcomes, and just wanted you guys to bring that into the discussion here today. Harry and Eric, can you unmute yourself?
Yeah, I'm unmuted. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Well, as I said in my question, what I'm seeing is a bias in favor of moderation and moderate outcomes. However, I think the desirability of that needs to be measured against not some abstract understanding of what's best, but against the very difficult situation that the country is in. I mean, in some ways, Joe Biden was the quintessential moderate, yet he has been unable or unwilling to damp down the war in the Ukraine. He's been his legislative agenda, while elements of it have passed, in my opinion, they don't dramatically enough address the issues that the country is facing. And if we put moderation as the desired outcome of the kinds of structures we're going to implement at the electoral level, aren't we simply opting de facto and perhaps explicitly for a status quo that I think most Americans, certainly this American, find unsatisfactory?
Eric, did you have anything to add to that, or did Harry sum it up for you?
Well, I think I'm pretty much in agreement with him. I'm under perhaps most times in history, the political center, and just in a mathematical sense, is approximately what people would call moderate. But sometimes the majority of people really want a big change, and then that might not be considered moderate. We want a representative outcome, whether or not it's what would conventionally be called moderate, and that's what we should be focused on in our reforms, getting representative outcomes.
That's very clarifying. Any thoughts, guys?
I have a lot of thoughts. I think it's a fantastic question, and I really agree. I mean, part of the limitation of focusing on polarization and the fixation on that as a concept and a measurement, I think, is that it misses misses what you're saying. And you know, part of, like Christian was getting at this before, of like one way we could think of polarization is really in direct connection to representation. Like, do lawmakers sort of reflect the sort of ideological preferences, the policy preferences of their constituents, right? So you're right that there's a bias in moderation. And to the extent that I want to defend it, it is that most Americans do identify, like when you ask them a series of policy questions, they seem to be pretty moderate. Now, there's actually quite a bit of debate in the field about this. But there's a great article in the American Political Science Review that has gotten written up in the popular press by Anthony Fowler and some others. And they, I think, have the best way of measuring this to date. And they find, 70% roughly of Americans qualify as what we would call moderate. And so when we sort of have this bias towards more moderate behavior, I think that's more or less our implicit justification for this, is that most Americans are at least more moderate than the typical Democrat and the typical Republican. And so really, if we have to, but then that's the case if we have to shrink everything down to a one-dimensional left-right spectrum, right?
It's an ideological,
right? Maybe that process of simplifying everything is too much, and it misses out. And so I can say more on this, but I'll stop now. But I think that like, so some of my new research, what it's doing is, and I've done this in the past too, but is looking at specific policy, looking like closely at public policy and seeing like, how does governance change in these different election systems, and not just focus on like moderate outcomes, but on like problem solving in government. Like, does the top two system incentivize legislators to start push for more sort of pragmatic, even innovative reforms, and forget about whether we call them left, right, moderate, but like, are these innovative solutions to the problems that we're facing?
Got it.
Yeah, let me add a little bit to that too, if that's okay.
Yeah.
I agree. And so the discussion I think is really good. And so it's basically like, is moderation good? Well, it depends. Are you a moderate? If you're a moderate, you probably think it's good. And if you want something a little more extreme, you probably don't think it's good. But I think kind of in general, in the aggregate, Congress is facing a government shutdown. There's a 4-seat Republican majority. We'd be better off with 10 more moderates in Congress right now. Not everyone needs to be moderate, but a few more moderates might help the aggregate for some kind of just getting things done outcomes, and things that we don't maybe a couple people crossing party lines to work on some solutions might be helpful. And then in general, it's moderate doesn't necessarily mean that you're a moderate, voting sometimes to the left or sometimes to the right. It might just be you're in line with your district. So I live in Los Angeles, in an area that is extremely Democratic, right? There are Republicans, there are independents, but it's, the Democrat is going to win here. So the question is less about a moderate getting elected and more about, we regularly have Democrats running against each other in the general election because of the top two. So our choices are very competitive in general elections. I had a Democrat versus Democrat election where the Democrat won, I think, by 55% over another Democrat in the last election. So the question then is less about, are these people moderate? They're not going to be moderate because they're from Los Angeles. But are they the kind of person who, calls me up to try to get my vote, or ignores me because I'm in the close,
are they connected to the electorate? I think that's the thing
so that I think is really important to think about too, is just separate from polarization. The top two does encourage people to reach out in ways you won't see in the close primaries. Yeah.
All right, I'm going to move things along here. Both Sila Absil from New Mexico and Daryl Cruz from Chicago had a question about how open primaries increase minority representation in California. So Sila, I'm going to call on you to ask the question. Go ahead, Sila.
Hi, thank you so much for calling on me. I know it's Daryl's question, so I don't want to steal it, but my name is Scylla. I'm the executive director of New Mexico Open Elections, and we are pushing forth semi-open primaries in our state through the legislature because we do not have a ballot initiative in our state. And one of the main concerns we hear, particularly from the Democratic Party, is that, we are concerned to lose particularly female women of color representation if we do decide to go with open primaries. So just wanted to rebump Daryl's question to see if there are any findings you guys saw regarding increasing of minority representation through open primaries and possibly top two.
So first, there's not enough research on this as far as the impact in nonpartisan primaries so far, although Christian has actually done some of the best research on this. So I am going to otherwise punt to him, but say that like I think we need more of the kind of work that Christian has done.
Yeah, I agree. I agree with Rich. There's less than there could be done. One article I'll point out is by Sarah Sadwani, and who's a professor at Pomona College, and Jane Jun, who's a colleague of mine at USC. They wrote an article several years ago showing increases in racial and ethnic diversity after the top two was put in place compared to before. There were a lot of other reforms that happened at the same time, like the redistricting commission. So it's hard to pinpoint, is this the top two? Is it a suite of reforms that changed? Is it term limits and people kind of cycle through? But there is evidence of increasing diversity, both gender and racial and ethnic diversity, with the change in the primary system in California. Some of the research I've done with a few of my PhD students, including Raquel Santina, is that I'd have to go look in New Mexico. I'm not sure about New Mexico, but in a lot of states, Latino voters and Asian American voters are much more likely to be registered independents, and so they're less likely to be able to participate in a primary election. That could have spillover effects for who gets elected at the within districts and at the state level, and so what ends up happening on racial grounds is that Black voters and white voters are more frequently registered with political parties, and Latino and Asian American voters are registered as independent more frequently. So the closed system has an impact, especially on Asian American and Latino voters. And then anybody of any racial group who doesn't register as one of the major parties in a closed system. On gender, I think we don't know enough yet, and it'd be worth looking at states. I know in California, approximately I think almost 40% of the legislature is female, and that was not the case a decade ago. There also have been top two instances where like a male Democrat wasn't that responsive to his district, and a woman ran against him, and a woman Democrat ran against him and surprised him in a very Democratic district in the Los Angeles area. So there is potentially evidence, but I think we need more research on that.
Great, thank you. A question from Alyssa Larkin about party endorsements in the top two system. Go ahead, Alyssa.
Hi, sorry. I just wanted to hear your thoughts on whether you agree with party endorsements, not just in the top two, but in other top 4 or 5 systems, or if you have any particular opinion on it. Have you done any studies? This is for both of you.
Yeah. So I do have an opinion on this, and just to make sure this isn't too much of a safe space, I'm gonna make put my opinion out there because it's probably going to be controversial in this group. So, but I'm going to say it anyway, which is I think political parties play a crucial role in democracy, and that we're better with strong, vibrant political parties. And so I am all about giving parties the ability to endorse candidates. And to have, like, I don't love Nebraska at the state legislative level has a sort of similar system to the top two because they have nonpartisan primaries. And no parties listed on the ballot. The candidates don't identify with a party. Of course, they really are, most of them really are partisans when they get into the legislature. But it's not a feature that I love about the Nebraska system. So I think that there are real benefits, and I could say a lot on this. So I'll sort of, I'll leave it for a follow-up if anybody wants to ask, or if Christian wants to chime in on this. But I would say, I think I'm a big fan of the top two system of allowing voters to have a say and allowing all voters to have a say in the nomination process, in the primary election. But I do think political parties should have the ability to endorse candidates, to have the party on the ballot. I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, I'll just add, I think it's just part of the way things will be, no matter what your system is. Parties are going to endorse candidates. I do think in the top two, a lot of the time, the Democratic Party endorsed candidate wins at the state level, but not always, right? So we had a Senate election a few years ago where the party endorsed candidate advanced to the general election and ran against another Democrat, the two Democrats, and the person not endorsed by the party won. So you do end up having a role that the parties are playing. And I also think it depends on what party endorsements mean. Are we talking about, 300 people who gathered for a convention in Anaheim one day, or are we talking about sort of like more wide-ranging advocacy organizations that may be affiliated with parties that can exert some influence? And so I do think also the top two has allowed for parties to be a little more heterogeneous, right? So you've got different groups of people within the Democratic Party who think differently in California, and they can exert a bit more influence by trying to get their person to the general to face another Democrat, right? And the same thing with Republicans. So out in the high desert of California, if you starting to head towards Las Vegas, it's very Republican, and you have competing factions of the Republican Party that are using the top two to endorse different candidates, where you have kind of a Trump style Republican Party, and then more of a kind of Arnold Schwarzenegger Republican Party competing against each other in the general election in the top two. And so I think the parties have a way to exert effort in that, exert some influence in that way.
That's interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. We've had a number of people ask questions, some variety of compare top two with top three, top four, top five, with approval voting, with ranked choice voting. What's the benefits? What's the downsides? So I'm gonna condense all these into one question by Rich Stevenson from Louisville, Kentucky. Go ahead, ask your question, Rich, on behalf of a bunch of people.
Oh, crap.
No pressure.
No pressure, right? Well, I'm from Louisville, Kentucky, and I was born here. We lived in Ohio 43 years and had a semi-open primary system in Ohio. I was used to that. Came back to Kentucky, have a closed primary system, and everything is Republican here. It stinks with red. And we had Amy ran against Mitch McConnell for the Senate race, and whenever it was, a couple years ago, and she was given $40 million by our Democratic Party in Kentucky. That ended the primary election. And there were two candidates on that ballot that would have been who would have had a much better chance of defeating Mitch McConnell. And we probably would have had our former president would have been impeached if it hadn't been for that son of a bitch, pardon my language. And so, yeah, I like the idea of there being candidates who are not put on the ballot by Wall Street, and Wall Street influenced this woman Amy to be a semi-Republican. She wasn't a Democrat. No way in hell she was a Democrat, but she was on the ballot. We had two Republicans on the ballot that from the closed primary system, and Mitch McConnell wore bib overalls every place in Kentucky, and so he won. So we need to have a final five open primary so we have more candidates on the ballot, and so people have more choices in the general election, so people get through to the general election. That's my opinion. You can tell I have a strong opinion about that. And then in the general election, then you have an RCV system, which takes those top five, and you have somebody win the election with 50% of the vote. That's a big deal, because radical candidates cannot get 50% of the vote. People like Trump, people like whoever. Also, I think we should have the presidential election. We should have Joe Biden would have had 3 electoral votes if we had the electoral votes proportion to the amount of votes. He would have had 3 here, and Trump would have had 5. And I wonder what would happen. What would have happened in 50 states if that had been done? If every state had proportional electoral votes, who would have won that election, and by how much? I think Biden would have won it by a lot bigger than he did. It would have been
Interesting. Well, you put a lot of stuff.
Well, anyway, I'm talking a lot. I'm sorry. What?
No, it's fine. It's good. So what if people say this? They're like, hey, California is a good system, but it doesn't allow for more choices in the general election. What do you say to that, Christian and Rich?
You want to first question?
Sure, I'll go first. So, I mean, I think it depends on what you want, right? And so here's the thing, right? So I want to kind of bring it back to what I think is most common in places like Kentucky and a number of other states is close primaries. When you have close primaries, you have an incentive for moving towards the party activist and extremist in the primary election, and then the general election is usually, if it's a state or a district in which one party's dominant, it doesn't make a difference. Like there's not much. There's zero choice because you're basically having one candidate. You know, in a place like Kentucky, often an R who's going to beat a D, and then in a place like California, statewide, a D who's often going to beat an R, right? And so to me, the top two and the top four and other systems have similarities because you have a general election where there are people of the same party on the ballot in the general. And so, there's pros and cons. I think the top two advantage is that there's two candidates. And when they're of the same party, the choice is actually easier because there's only two. It might sound like you have limited choice, but when you have less choice, when you have more choice, people sometimes have trouble making decisions based on psychology research. But then on the other hand, the top four, you might have people who want to vote for, like in California, if you're a Republican, you might want to vote for a Republican and then pass your vote on to a Democrat that you would prefer over who might have won in a closed primary system. I'm also doing, most of my research has been on the top two, so I don't know if I have as much to say on other systems. I look forward to studying. I am starting to study the Alaska system, but I'll probably pass it over to Rick, who's done a little bit more on this.
But aren't the candidates that get on the ballot in the top two system, aren't they the wealth primary? They're put on there by the money that comes from Wall Street, from out of state, from out of the districts. So they're bought and put on the ballot by moneyed interests, by financial interests.
So, I mean, I don't know if that's the case anymore in any primary system, right? You're probably going to get people who are well funded by people who want to get them elected. I think the funding opportunities for funding alternative candidates are higher probably in non-closed primary systems.
Yeah, what Ross Perot, the Reform Party, had.
Oh, I guess we lost Rich. Did you have, Dr. Barton, did you have thoughts about that?
Yeah, so I agree with Christian's characterization. I think I would say, continuing in the direction of it depends on what you're looking for out of a system. I would say it depends on what you're looking for. And then I would also say, we should also be thinking about what's politically feasible. And I think right now, ranked choice voting has for whether rightly or wrongly has become really a hot button issue and really under assault by Republicans. And I think in a lot of places, enacting something like a top two nonpartisan primary system, where you can get a majority winner in the general election without instant runoff voting is an easier sell and is we're more likely to get that kind of reform. And so from a political feasibility standpoint, I think that there's advantages to top two where we don't need to do ranked choice voting. However, here's what I will say, and I suspect that I'm more comfortable with a system that maintains the sort of two-party duopoly, but gets the two parties to be more representative of the public. And I think that the top two system, that's the sort of outcomes that we see. In my analysis, I see independent candidates didn't do very well in California before the top two, and they're doing even worse now. And I think that makes sense because most of the candidates who are advancing to the general election are Democrats or Republicans. And so what's happening are, independents and third-party candidates who weren't going to win the general election, but at least got to campaign until November, right? They're not even getting to do that. So it does weaken those third parties and those independent candidates in a way that a top four system doesn't. And so if you think that, if you're focused on political feasibility or if you think that the solution can be making the two-party system more representative, I think the top two system is for you. If you think the only way to fix the system is to have a multi-party system, then maybe it's worth pushing for a top four or a top five, but recognize that because if you want that system to have a winner who gets an outright majority, then like the question is, how do you do that? That through ranked choice voting, we need to be able to sell that. And it's become, at least in this moment, it's become very difficult to sell to
Got it. One comment, and then we're going to go one final question from George Dyke, who has just a great question about presidential primaries. Something that would be fascinating to research. Your statement, Dr. Barton, that the third parties had no power under the old system and even less under the new system. I think it would be worth doing some research on what does that look like? Because my sense is there are Green Party and Peace and Freedom Party and Libertarian Party candidates that are getting 10 or 15% in the primary, not enough to go to the general election, but maybe they're in a power broker position with regards to the final two candidates. But I have no evidence of that. There's no scholarship on that, of the role of, in some ways, the role of the losers in the top two. What do they play going forward? Anyway.
That's a really
can I say one thing real fast, John?
Yeah.
I think I think we need to systematically study it, but just anecdotally in my own congressional district, we have Green and Democratic candidates running against each other in the second round election, or we have two Democrats. That's what ends up happening because of the kind of place where I happen to live.
Right.
And then out in the Republican parts of California, you have Republicans and Libertarians who show up on the general election.
That's worth more, because I actually don't think the top two is synonymous with two-party monopoly. I think there's more fissures there, but more research to be done. All right.
Yeah.
George Dyke is going to close us out with a question about presidential debates and presidential primaries. Keep it brief, George. We got 1 minute. Go ahead.
No pressure.
Yeah, no pressure. You're gonna ask your question? I guess we lost George. Well, I'll ask it for him. George said, I'd like to see nonpartisan presidential primaries and nonpartisan debates. How could that be done? Big question, 20 seconds from each of you.
So, I mean, states could implement their own nonpartisan presidential primaries. It would take a lot of, it would be a bit of a mess, but it's not something that can't be done. And yeah, if all candidates were competing directly against each other, what would that look like on the debate stage? That would also look like a mess, but probably a better mess than what we currently have. Christian, what do you think?
Yeah, so I think it would be really fun to see candidates who are Democrats and Republicans and possibly some other third party candidates on the same debate stage during the primary. That might actually, to me, that would be informative to a primary voter, because you'd see how they might perform in a general election. I would love to see that on the debate stage.
That would be great to see, like Biden, Trump, Cornel West, others, all kinds of people up there debating. That would be really, really interesting. All right, we've run out of time. We could go on for another 2 hours. Thank you both, Christian and Richard, and everyone today for taking time out of your afternoon. This discussion will be up on YouTube in about 48 hours. Please share it with your friends and colleagues. I think this is a very important look at a very important question. Thank you. We'll see you next month. Have a great one. Any final words, Christian or Richard? Anything you're plugging? Any movies coming out that you're starring in?
I'll just say, if you haven't seen it, watch the Arnold documentary on Netflix. I have a very short cameo at the end of the documentary.
Excellent. It's a great documentary.
Oh, that's fantastic. I will be in a documentary on the Alaska reform that comes out TBD. I don't know when the release date is on that. But thank you, John, for hosting and organizing this. Christian, thank you for your time. It's always a pleasure. I look forward to seeing you both next week. And thank you to all the participants for really excellent and not always easy, but really excellent questions and conversation. I appreciate it.
Great. Have a great day, everybody. Take care.
Bye, guys.